I'm honored to have two people whom I respect deeply and immensely to participate in this discussion with me. First, we have Professor Resh Budhu, who has spent many years working in the field of social justice in areas of gender equality, anti-racism, education, and the arts. She's also taught for over 10 years in the Community Worker Program at George Brown College and is the coordinator of the annual Tommy Douglas Institute. And I've taken many courses with Resh, and I can say that she has the unique power of holding people's rapt attention, even though it's a Monday 8 a.m. class. So I really miss being in her class. We also have my friend Drew Silverthorne. He's currently enrolled in the Bachelor of Social Work program at Ryerson. Drew's role at the Campus Food Center as the Campus Food Center coordinator sparked his interest in unearthing why so many students are struggling to make ends meet. And so it led him to co-author Canada's first Campus Hunger Report. Drew just joined the national staff at Meal Exchange to expand national research and advocacy efforts on post-secondary food insecurity. He's also an amazing cook. He's one of the people who is responsible for the best dessert I've ever had, which is surprisingly chocolate lentil balls. So before we jump into the discussion, I wanted to let you know that we have a Google document that I shared with you earlier. That's a great place to look at some of the resources that we have for you, and it's also a great place to put in your questions and comments that we will be taking up at the end of today's session. Today we'll be talking about the symptoms, the supporting symptoms of student poverty, some of its supporting and root causes, why we need to change this, and how we can start to work to achieve change. There'll be an opportunity, like I said, for us to take up your questions in the last period, and we'll hopefully get to as many as we can. If you are on social media, then we'd be happy for you to engage with this. You can answer some of the questions that I'm going to be asking the discussants today. Just tag at Meal Exchange or use the hashtag #EndStudentPoverty, and we can track and boost what you have to say. We want to hear from you as well. First, let's talk about some of the ways in which student poverty you two have witnessed it. Could you share one experience where you witnessed a student who is experiencing poverty and how it affected you? Maybe we could start with Drew.
Sure. So like Michael said, I'm one of the coordinators of the Campus Food Bank at Ryerson. And recently I took someone up to our rooftop garden so one of our members could pick what kind of lettuce she wanted. And I think it was because we had this opportunity to be alone. There was nobody at the rooftop garden that she expressed to me her gratitude for the service, and she told me that she was a mother and an international student, that she had 2 children, and that she was doing her master's. And she really thanked me for the service and all the work that we were doing. However, it really broke my heart because it kind of drove home to me the people who are using the services and how much they're struggling. So this woman has come from another country, she's raising kids, she's trying to do her master's, and at the same time she's been using the Campus Food Bank for over 3 years. And so I'm blown away by the amount of energy she has and the amount of courage she has to come and use that service. However, I wish I wasn't having that conversation with her. I wish she wasn't thanking me. She was actually generous enough to say that when she graduates, because we've helped her out so much, she wants to buy us a new fridge. And that was something that just broke my heart to hear, because there's this sense where she feels like she owes us something, but I don't think she should be feeling that way. I think she should be feeling like she has been wronged in this situation and that she hasn't received the supports that she needs and that she deserves.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, Drew. Resh?
It was when, you had prepared us with this question, I was really thinking about, there are so many different manifestations of poverty that we see among our students. And so we have students who can't make it to school. They'll write and say, sorry, I missed class, I don't have bus fare. There are students who say that, I can't deal with my child care. Students who come to school hungry and they can't concentrate because of that. There was one particular, if I had to choose, I guess this is one that immediately came to mind, is we had one student who, very bright, very motivated student who at the same time was homeless. And so he was living in a shelter. And at some points he was living on the street. And it was because, shelters, they're full of desperate people, and sometimes that desperation turns on one another, and so it can be very unsavory places to be. And sometimes he'd say, when the weather's good, I'll sleep out on the street. And yet he was coming into class, always handing in his assignments. You could see the paper was really crinkled, smeared with, ink and whatnot, because he said, I don't have a place in the shelter to store my stuff. And then sometimes he wouldn't come to school at all. And when he returned, at one point, he was injured, he had been beaten, all of those types of things that are associated with the violence, the dangers of living in these situations. So he was dealing with the structural violence of poverty that was manifesting in very real physical violence as well. And he's certainly not the only student. Over the years, we had students who have been on the street, but while they're coming to school, and just to talk about how I was feeling about that, it's heartbreaking and it's infuriating that something like this is happening in what is one of the richest countries in the world. And it should not be happening, because education should be a guaranteed right. And so as teachers, we find we have to respond. We have to respond in terms of how we teach, what we're teaching, recognize that these people are coming in with the real lived experiences. I teach in community work of what we're talking about. But also in terms of how we respond, we have, my faculty group have set up an emergency petty cash fund, so that when students say, I don't have enough money to travel, I don't have enough money to eat, we'll say, well, here, right? And we also can't give that much because our numbers are decreasing, so our funds are decreasing. But we've decided to do that. And I really suspect that there are many other faculty groups, maybe all of them, that do this. And, and try to broker them or direct them towards, mechanisms within the college. But again, it's tough getting those, and there's competition for that as well, right? So.
Well, thanks to both of you for sharing your experiences there. I want to turn now to a story that's been in the media and in social media over the last couple of weeks. A few weeks ago, University of Toronto released a story about a student who just graduated. He's an international student who had to rely on charity from friends to get food. At one point, he even ran out of money and had to live in a homeless shelter before eventually finding a friend's den to squat in. The story was treated by both U of T and the Toronto Star as a story that celebrates students' survival despite the odds. Here's a direct quote from the Toronto Star article. How this impish, gifted student from Vietnam overcame economic odds to become a molecular biology whiz, a dazzling researcher, and a teaching assistant so talented he now trains other tutorial leaders, speaks to his grit, to Canadian kindness, and the fact it can take a village to raise an academic rock star. So I would like to just get your comment on what this means and how we should be thinking about the story, and just your reaction to this new story that we've seen. Would you like to begin, Drew?
Sure. The article was so strange, and the press release was very strange because it kind of pushed the onus off of the university and off into kind of, they just talked about like economic issues, and it doesn't actually sound like it took a village to raise this person. It sounded like this person did most of this work on their own by struggling quite a bit. And so it was fascinating how U of T took this story and spun it as a success story rather than what it was, and it was a tragedy. It was a story of someone who had limited access to education, who had received quite a bit of money, but even that was not enough to attend the institution. And I was blown away that it was framed as such, as kind of, here's an success story. And I think it's a reflection of this cultural belief that students should struggle, that it's part of their journey, that working multiple part-time jobs or staying in a shelter is just part of the experience, and that there's a high payoff from this investment, this emotional and financial investment that people are putting into education. However, that's not the case. As we've seen, youth unemployment is very high right now. Youth underemployment is also an increasing problem. So this cultural idea needs to shift, and I think that cultural idea was very present in here, where it's kind of this idea that we all go through the struggle when we're in school, but we'll all persevere through the end of it. However, that's not the reality. This story didn't talk about the people who drop out of school. This story didn't talk about the folks who are coming to campus food banks on a regular basis. This story didn't talk about what had happened in between those homeless shelters, like Resh was talking about violence that could have been experienced. So I felt like the story swept quite a few things under the rug.
Okay, thanks.
I would agree with Drew. I think that what it did is it really, and we see so many of these stories these days, that it's really sort of putting a nice icing over the structural issues that are happening here. Why was this young man having to go, after he's paid so much money as an international student, first of all? What do they pay, like 3 times the amount?
Yeah,
to,
just let me add,
yeah.
It seems that the international fees are $33,000 a year.
That's insane, right? That's like 5 times the amount, because
Mm-hmm.
it is 5 times the amount, or over 5 times the amount. So he had to do all of this, not talking about the hardships to even get to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But then what is happening within Canada that we need these young people? We actually really need our graduating population. We need an immigrant population, because by 2036 we're going to have the largest seniors and retiree populations we've ever had. So we should be supporting these people, not making the reality that they have to go to shelters and whatnot, but that is the reality. That he should have been supported. This should not have been happening at all. But the way in which it was spun is that, hey, let's not talk about the systemic issues here. Let's talk about the exception. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's always talking about the exception to the rule. So you have to wonder, well, if this young man managed to, through luck and determination and really nice friends, not a village, because the Canadian village seems to have really kind of failed there. How many others, how many hundreds of others, or actually did not climb out of that and had to go back to their countries of origin, or are still in a shelter, or are in a survival job and have had to drop out of school, right? So I think that, this is a problem, an institutional failure it's talking about, both in terms of educational institution, but also policy failure at the macro level in terms of what's happening in Canada. But also I would question journalism, because journalism seems to be really not doing its job, which is to hold up a mirror to our society, to say, this is where we can reflect on what's going on. So.
Okay, great. Yeah. If I may share my opinion quickly, I think that it's kind of like we're getting into the point where campus food banks seem to have been kind of normalized, and now what's alarming about this story is that like homelessness is now other kind of symptoms or poverty are just being kind of normalized as just something that students will just be expected to go through. One thing I wanted to, we talked about, so this story talks about somebody who succeeded or survived despite the odds. Do either of you know of students who have who have dropped out? Could you talk a little bit about like how prevalent you were seeing this, and how, like, tell me a little bit more about the story about people who don't, survive their education experience?
Would you like to?
It really is a mixed bag, particularly, I guess, within the college, where the reason for colleges was to create a point of access for populations that could not otherwise get into the more elite institutions and universities, right? So we came about in around the 70s or 80s. So what we continue to see historically, systemically marginalized populations that are dealing with deep-rooted poverty. And so when they come to college, very often we'll hear, well, I'm the first of my family, and it's said with such pride. And yet they are dealing with now not only balancing education, but they have to balance the survival jobs that the majority of our students are working. And many of them are parents as well. And they're dealing with, a job economy that seems to be tanking, right? So secure jobs with benefits are disappearing, or they're going away, and they're being taken over by really precarious jobs within employment. So we're seeing more and more of that. People who leave, it's not normally because they want to leave before they graduate, it's because they have to. And sometimes those people will come back again and again, and then there are more struggles. And we're not even getting into the health issues, because these are social determinants of health, so we're seeing an increase in anxiety issues, mental health issues, physical issues, all of those types of things. So it's becoming more of a reality. To pinpoint one, it's difficult, because this is as well becoming sort of the expectation that we have now.
Okay.
Right. But unfortunately, when we're when people are talking about it in articles like the Star article, it would be about it's sort of their individual failure, and so they're also dealing with that when there is a definite social impetus.
Yeah, did you want to throw in something?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the food bank, we have quite a few conversations with students who are really nervous about how they're going to pay for their next semester of tuition fees. We've had students who they'll have their grades withheld from them, and then they won't be able to apply for their masters because they've had like a back payment of money that they've had to pay back to the university. We also have folks who just drop off the map altogether, and I'm assuming that at least half the time those are students who have just dropped out of the school. However, there's so much shame around those conversations and so much onus on the individual that those conversations don't happen. I don't want to say they don't happen as much as I want to, but it's hard to get those conversations out of people who are coming to use a food bank, because it's already such an embarrassing situation. And students are just, it's amazing how much they don't want to burden us with those things, but that's kind of why we're there, to have those conversations with them. So it's definitely something that I've seen there quite a bit. It's scary.
Great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts there. So I want to turn a little bit more to, you've both referred quite a bit to some of the supporting issues that are like grounded in policy. If we can maybe just come up with a few of the main reasons that we're seeing this kind of level of student poverty. Love to get your comments on that. Whoever would like to go first.
I would say that whatever we're seeing happening in the society, we will also see happen within our classrooms, because our classrooms are a microcosm of the society. So when I'm looking at my students, I'm not just seeing students. I'm seeing students who are dealing with skyrocketing tuition fees and reduced government spending on education, which has really been happening within the last couple of decades. But I'm also seeing parents in that room, where there is no universal childcare policy. And so they have insecure childcare, if any childcare at all. I'm also seeing people who are in survival jobs. So I have students who will work all night cleaning an office and then come directly from work into class, and they're so exhausted. And then they're looking at you wondering, am I going to dock them marks because they fell asleep in class? And then I'm asking myself, as a teacher here, how do I punish a student for trying to survive? I'm seeing, people who we're seeing such a rise in, mental anxieties, mental disorders that are also going into physical disorders, because we know that certain populations have higher rates of diabetes and whatnot. That's also coming into the classroom. So for me, this question about student poverty, it becomes a question of poverty, because that's what exists within our classroom.
Yeah.
But from my point of view, working with an educational institution, my question would then be, then what is the institutionalized response to poverty, which will also be a response to student poverty.
Okay, great.
I would agree with that as well. I think it's a reflection of an economic and political system that is just plain and simple not working, especially when it comes to the needs of young people or mature students as well. It's interesting because in 2014, the Governor General of Canada said that youth just needed to work in unpaid positions to gain experience. And so there's this, even from people in these high positions of authority, are suggesting that students need to live through poverty in order to build up their resumes. I also think that universities are starting to treat students as if students are kind of these cash cows. Recently at Ryerson this past year, the student union discovered that the university was sitting on a $14 million surplus. That surplus wasn't for a structural fund or it wasn't for a project. It was just $14 million that the university was sitting on. The university is an educational nonprofit institution. That money should be redistributed back to students. That money shouldn't just be sitting in a fund for the university to do with what they please. And so it's interesting that these universities and colleges and educational institutions are kind of moving towards these models where they're starting to emphasize this profit rather than emphasizing what kind of outcomes are they producing, who has access to education. And I can't imagine what our world would be like if everybody had access to education and how quickly we would be able to come up with amazing, innovative solutions to so many social and environmental and technological problems. But clearly that's not something that's on these institutions' minds. It comes down to finances and funding.
Okay.
And I would just, add to that. I think that, where we have, what we're hearing is that, it's cuts to education as well. And so you do have those monies. Yes, students are more and more, we're asking those questions. Are you students or are you education consumers?
Mm-hmm.
We're hearing these types of terminology as well, right? And, in Canada, historically, we've gone from, cost sharing between the federal and provincial governments in education to block funding, within which we're losing funding for all of these social welfare, education, healthcare, and then the responsibility for recovering that funding is being downloaded onto students who have to pay these incredible tuition fees. So we have had, tuition fees have tripled since the 90s. In Ontario, we have the highest tuition rates. And then you have all of the ancillary fees that are heaped onto the top of that. So it's becoming more difficult for students in universities and colleges to get by. And this is in a place where we were really talking not so long ago about the universality of education. We've signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in terms of all of these things. But it was also, you brought up the GG, the Governor General. He had done an interview in Maclean's where he was saying those same types of things, but he was also saying, but the answer is within volunteerism. The answer is within supporting your neighbor and this and that. Which are, and this is the rhetoric that we're hearing. Let's build up the volunteer spirit. Volunteer spirit is great. I'm a community worker and a community worker professor. Love volunteerism, love community supports for one another, but at the point where your government is absolving themselves of their social contract responsibility and downloading that onto the shoulders of common everyday people who will help out each other in one of the richest nations on earth, this becomes a problem.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for sharing that analysis. And so what would you say, so we talked about like tuition, we talked about jobs. One thing that kind of irks me, I think it's great that we have a federal jobs program in the Canada Summer Jobs Program, of which Meal Exchange hires many students. The issue with that program is that it's very limited contracts. So Drew is now working with Meal Exchange for the summer, but we were only provided with 8 weeks contract full time at minimum wage. So it doesn't cover the whole summer, and barely puts a dent in
and minimum wage is $11.
Is $11 in Ontario, and actually that's the highest minimum wage in the country. So we have some national staff who work in other provinces who are given less, so they give the absolute minimum for these Canada Summer Jobs. And really, when you do the math, that barely makes a dent in their tuition fees. Even if they lived at home, they didn't spend a dime, it would still not cover their education. There was a time when people could work a summer and pay for their education. So it does irk me.
I think as well that this is causing like stresses on the education system as well. I can say from being a student at university, my professors are so frustrated with the amount of work that students are able to do. And I think especially in things like community services, people are attracted to those programs because of things that have gone on in their own lives. oftentimes, but they're struggling with those things, and I think poverty is a major one. So when you're working multiple jobs or you're looking after your children and you don't have the time to do your homework, you're coming to class is unproductive for you and for the professor because you haven't been able to do the work. And so I don't think it's not just an impact on the students, and it's an impact on the learning environment for all of the students, and the quality of education that teachers can provide to students when students can only give so much of themselves to the class experience.
And I think that you're right, and I think it really is. It's coming down to what it is neoliberalism, is that we're dealing with neoliberal trends, which is deregulation, privatization, cuts to existing social welfare, which includes education, and also trade liberalization, because this is a global reality. And so, speaking from a faculty perspective, what we're also seeing is that, increased class sizes. So we're going from, 30 students to maybe 60 students. We're seeing more and more of our faculty, I think it's about 70% or over 70% of faculty now in post-secondaries are contract faculty. So that means that they are paid for the hours that they're in that class, but there are so many other things that faculty do. So they're actually, when you work it out, they could be earning, minimum wage or even below that, given all of the extra responsibility. And they have to deal with these pressures that the students are experiencing as well. So as we have more students with, sorts of disabilities and accommodation needs, that has to be served by the faculty. So, things are being downloaded onto the students, all of this, the funding and whatnot, but then the responsibilities of catering to it are also being downloaded onto frontline workers, faculty, and support workers as well. And so, that adds to a really tense environment.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about, I think it'd probably be a good idea to talk a little bit about so student poverty is a growing issue. Our evidence of that is campus food bank usage and stories like this, and other studies that have been released recently. So for instance, at Acadia University, they did a study on student food insecurity. And this is quite hot off the presses because they just presented it at a conference that Meal Exchange was at. They found a prevalence rate of food insecurity at Acadia University, which is in Nova Scotia, of 38.1%. And just for frame of reference, Nova Scotia has the highest food insecurity in the country, and that's only at 17.5%. So it's almost more than double. Another thing that the researcher told me was that when you control for people who are not on the meal plan, the numbers jump to almost 50%. So there's more study needs to be done into looking at just how prevalent this issue is. But we can tell from all the stories we're seeing, and we're connecting these dots that are happening on campuses, that it's a growing issue. So now the question for me is, what happens if we don't do anything to deal with the student poverty we have right now, or if it gets worse? That's a question I'd like to kind of pose to you and say, what projecting the future, what does this mean if nothing's done to change it?
I would encourage people to think of student poverty outside of just the context of what's happening on a campus. So, for instance, student poverty is racist in that it's already so difficult for racialized people to get to university and college. And so if they can't even get their foot in the door, and if once they do get their foot in the door, they're struggling to stay there, that is a reflection of something that's happening on a much broader scale, but the education system is just perpetuating that. I would also say that it causes, like Resh was saying, a lot of mental health and physical health issues. There has been some research that's linked debt and the ability to pay debt off and the time that it takes debt off for students to increase mental health problems. And then that can trickle down to if you're stressed all the time about paying your student loans off or paying your bills or even being able to pay your tuition, you're not going to be a very happy person. I think it comes down to not eating properly, not sleeping enough, when you're working multiple jobs to be in school or working one job. I think, like I said before, I also think it limits there's so much buzz around innovation, and I think it really limits innovation when students are being held down by their inability to fully give themselves to their school experience.
Great. So,
I would agree with all of that, and I think that it harms society in the long term as well, right? So you will see, I think the future is, we can see it, it's right here on our doorstep, so it's not hard to imagine because we're seeing it. So you're seeing all of those things that Drew just talked about. You're seeing more people who are dropping out. You're seeing more people who are doing poorly in school, who are really, desperate for finding jobs once they graduate, because now I don't know any program that can guarantee you a job, particularly a secure job within this economy. I don't know if you can do that anymore. But the thing is, what we should be able to rely on our graduates to do is to be able to, have had a good quality education, because quality of education suffers here, right? Because they are supposed to be the ones who will take over the professional, sectors within our society. They're the ones who are going to make our society move forward and function, particularly when we're going to have this huge population retiring in the very near future, right? So we need them to take those jobs. We need them to be able to work with retired populations and elderly populations in terms of the supports that they need, workers, caregivers, so that those populations can live a life of dignity. We need the students, the graduates, to have families, to have more kids, because we need population growth. And because of poverty, they're putting off all of those things, right? We need them not to go into the emergency survival job, but to be able to have that time to look for the good job, if it is actually out there. And to be able to be free of debt, so that they're not holding on to their money, but that they can spend it into the economy, because it's only through spending in the economy that the economy circulates and it works, right? So there are so many ways in which student poverty just hurts us everywhere within our society. And ethically it hurts us as well. These are our people, they're our residents, they're our citizens, they're our young people, they're our older people. Where is our social citizenship in terms of our responsibility towards these people? There's a larger ethical question here about not letting people go poor, again with an origination. It doesn't have to happen here.
okay.
Yeah.
I think I loved everything that you said, by the way. That really spoke to me. And I think as well that it kind of perpetuates the divide between the rich and the poor, where the wealthy are able to go to school and they're able to go to competitive programs, where I've seen at the campus food bank that some engineering students struggle so much because the programs are so intense and so competitive. So if you have to work while you're doing engineering, those students are the ones who fall behind, where the students who have parents who have been able to pay for all of their expenses are the ones who are excelling. And so if you're using education as an exit strategy from poverty, which most likely you have to do because the majority of jobs need an education now, you're being barred from that. So ultimately, we're just perpetuating people's situations that they're in, and we're making folks struggling with poverty. We're continuing to keep them in poverty, and we're continuing to make wealthy people wealthy through education.
Absolutely, and just to add on that, because you just opened a can of worms with that question. But also, how people will react will be very telling as well. So what we're seeing is people can react in the best way, which is to form solidarity between groups and say, because wherever there is resistance, as I always taught you, wherever there's oppression, there's always resistance. And this is just part of who we are as human beings. And so people will, right now we're seeing, the anti-austerity protests happening in London. We saw them happening in Montreal. Something has been happening in Canada this year, where right across Canada we have seen people, parents, teachers, students taking to the streets in terms of what's happening with education, right? So there is protest, but it could easily go the other way, that you could have deepening divides between populations. We have many different diversities within Canada. The fault lines are already there that can be exacerbated by crisis. And so what could happen again is that, where people feel disempowered to operate against those at the policy level, those in government, what they will do is they will turn those tensions either against each other in terms of a horizontal type of violence against each other, or they could be proactive about it and form solidarity. So it could go either way. We're certainly seeing it happening, both things happening throughout the world today.
Yes. Well, actually, yeah, talking about poverty is like, it seems like half of the story, because inequality is the other kind of discussion. I just did an interview with Henry Giroux, which we'll be releasing soon on Meal Exchange's YouTube account. But he talked about how inequality is actually growing at a faster rate in Canada than it is in the United States. He also talked about our social spending, like that we spend $200 million a piece on F-35 jets, and yet students are living in poverty. So the whole inequality and different kind of priorities that we have are a huge part of this piece.
And we could say that, really, in Canada, it is inequality. That Canada, as I keep saying, is a rich nation. It really gets that. It's a rich nation. It's different from, say, the nation that my family comes from, which is Guyana, right? So that's an example where there's poverty, but that's because it's a poor nation.
Mm-hmm.
In Canada, it's a rich nation, but we have poverty. So in Guyana, the poverty is because of a genuine lack of resources, right? And political decisions that are made, but a genuine lack of resources. In Canada, we don't have a lack of resources. Our problem is because of political decisions that are being made, and how that's leading to this incredibly imbalanced distribution of wealth throughout our population.
Okay, thanks. So since we're on the topic of like alternate realities or alternate futures, maybe talking about protests, talking about things that are happening in Europe and in Canada, I want to turn now to like, we know we need to change things, but I wanted to start with maybe talking about food banks. So so my question to you is, are food banks making a difference? What is the problem with them? If there is a problem, I won't assume there is one, but if there is a problem, what is the problem? Are they making a difference, and what is the problem? Whoever wants to go first, take that.
Wants to go first?
Sure. So my feelings around food banks are mixed. I feel like food banks can do a fantastic job of bringing together community members, and on a campus it can do a great job of bringing together students who are having a similar experience and who can unite in that experience and maybe mobilize around that experience if they're not working too many part-time jobs. However, I think food banks also allow universities, colleges, and on a broader scale, the government to look the other way and absolve themselves of the responsibility of dealing with the issue, because there's the assumption that there's already an intervention happening and that the intervention happening is adequate enough. So I do not believe that food banks are an effective way to intervene for food insecurity. I think food banks provide minimal assistance, and I think the folks who run food banks are doing the best that they can with very, very limited resources. And I don't think that the solution is tomorrow to close up all the food banks. However, I do think that the solution is a much broader change that needs to come from our governments. It needs to come from our university and colleges administrations.
I would absolutely agree. So I absolutely agree with that, and yeah, I am of two minds as well. So the same thing. I mean, food banks came around in the 70s, the 80s, right? Again, start of neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
There you go, food banks.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Just for the record, so everybody knows, the first campus food bank was opened up in '91.
Really? On-campus food bank.
Yeah,
right?
on-campus food
yeah.
bank in University of Alberta. Sorry.
Right.
Keep going.
So what happened is, but back then, when they were the non-campus food banks, when they were opening, it was really about a short-term contingency emergency response to immediate hunger that needed to be there, otherwise people would literally starve, right? But the thing was, it was the economy's not doing so well. When it picks up, then food banks can disappear. We won't need them anymore. Instead, what happened is the economy picked up. It went down, as economies do. But food banks just exploded, right? Everywhere. And so you have that they came onto campuses. They went into, different work environments and whatnot. You would have food banks. And so, yeah, it was there to meet the short-term response, the need, which is very real and needs to be met. But as Drew was saying, it also provided an out for government to get rid of any type of long-term social policy around food security, because they could, yes, absolutely absolve themselves of that responsibility. And what has happened is that food banks, because of that, because of those twin things sort of working together, they have become institutionalized, and they have become the institutionalized response. And because of that, what we have actually done is we have normalized a state of emergency around hunger in Canada, which is absolutely absurd. Right? So I think that food banks, they need to be a small part of a multifaceted approach to food insecurity that must include policy. And where policy is not there, then food banks should not only be about feeding populations, but about organizing populations to advocate for a policy or set of policies around food security.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. A few months ago, there was a really interesting visitor from the UK named Sept, who's from an organization called Food Up Front, I think. Hey, Sept, you'll be watching this later. And he came to Canada to look at community food centers, to look at food banks, and met with dozens of people. And what's interesting about the story in the United Kingdom is that they're just starting to have food banks. And they're actually having a public debate about it. And when talking to Seb and hearing about what's happening in the UK, like we're not at that point. Food banks have just become something that happens, and you're solicited for donations all the time. So it's just interesting to like put that into perspective, to like defamiliarize by looking at what's happening in the UK. I wanted to ask what the potential of food banks could be. Both of you kind of talked about how it needs to be part of a larger response, but maybe if you could tell me about elaborate a little bit more about how a food bank could be a site or at least a piece of a social change initiative, or like maybe more broadly than food banks, but just like charity, like food, emergency food assistance. What role does that play in social change? Resh sounds like she's ready.
They do, as I said, they do have, because these will be the places where those populations in need will be anyway. And they are there, they have the analysis. I mean, people do understand overwhelmingly what's happening within the society. We don't often hear that analysis within the mainstream, but they understand what's happening, right? So they become centers for organizing. I think that food banks would probably also be very much in agreement with the analysis that's coming here. They know they shouldn't be there. There are good people working at those food banks who don't want to be at those food banks. They don't want to, because many of them are volunteer driven as well, you know, that type of thing. I think they also need to, you know, sort of, you know, turn this whole discussion about, you know, are we charities or are we advocacy organizations? Because one of the things that's also happening within this really aggressive neoliberalism is that we are moving away from a rights-based society to charity delivery models for social welfare. And food banks would probably be one of the most obvious places where that is happening. So for them to reformulate themselves and say, you know what, why don't we stop being food banks, and why do we become centers for food advocacy, or why do we become centers for social organizing? Because, you know, the reality is in Canada, virtually every social welfare policy that we have has come from places like that, has come from populations organizing on the ground. So I think that's one way.
Okay, great.
So building off of that, talking about the potential of food banks, I think campus food banks have a phenomenal potential because the majority of them, from my research, do not have a charity status. They're run through their student unions that are often have nonprofit status but not charity status because they're so advocacy based. So campus food banks really have the potential to take this issue and run with it and be as loud with this issue as they want to, and not have to worry about any fallout around their charity status. Going back with what Resh said, I think food banks are just a place of organizing. And I think that some of the programs really are innovative, but I think that the programs there needs to be an understanding that these programs are not going to alleviate food insecurity on a long-term basis. So things like, we, together with Meal Exchange, we ran a community kitchen, and it was a fantastic opportunity to engage students and talk about issues of food insecurity and sustainability and government policy, and it was a phenomenal educational opportunity. But the point of it was never to reduce student food insecurity, because you simply can't do that with a community kitchen. However, you can do educational things with it. You can build capacity and skills and knowledge. And so I think that's where food banks and food centers really have their strong point. And I think it's so important to drive home the point, though, that is the limit of what they're going to be able to really accomplish, and that we really need to be fighting at the policy level for interventions for food security.
And I think it's very important what Drew was saying about the on-campus food banks, because the other thing about our educational centers is, aside from government, these are the places where all of the ideas about what our society is going to be, this is where we exchange, debate, create new ideas, maybe get rid of the bad ideas where this is supposed to happen. So given that, the on-campus food banks, they're part of this life, which is supposed to happen within educational centers. So part of that is that we also have to really protect campuses from privatization and from deregulation and from those neoliberal trends, to say, we are democratic centers, and then food banks need to on-campus food banks take advantage of that.
Okay, great. So we will definitely be dealing with this exact question of how to, throughout this project, it'll be a self-reflexive sort of process with the on-campus food banks and all the students and all the campus food banks that are involved, to see what can we really do here, and how does our efforts connect to the broader social change. Before we get into asking questions from the audience, I'd like you both to maybe talk about, we talked about what kind of policies we might need, and you talked a little bit about protest, and you talked about how food banks are limited in terms of protest. My question is, what would it take to end student poverty, or to start moving in a different direction? What would it take, not in terms of what the policy would be, but what would it take in terms of social movements and political change to make that possible?
I think one of the biggest things is research. There's very, very limited research on the experience of student food insecurity. And so I think that's a really, really crucial part, because once we start doing that research, we can start understanding the issue more, and we can start having larger and bigger and louder conversations about student food insecurity.
Okay, great.
I would say that I would tell people to stop buying into the lie that people can't do anything about what's happening. So that would be my first thing. To just look at Canadian history in terms of, if you look at what was happening from the pre-war years to the post-war years, that was just a matter of decades, where we went from almost an abyss of social policy, there was none, to having one of the healthiest times in social welfare in Canada. And that was done largely through people mobilizing, working through the vote, but also mobilizing with one another. You don't even have to go back in history. Let's go to Quebec. Look at what they're doing. Their tuitions are just so manageable, so low. They have no food banks on campus, right? The examples are right there. The mechanisms are there. And then, I know not policy, but we already have a policy model of how we can treat post-secondary education. We do not have. We're one of the few industrialized nations that does not have a federal oversight over post-secondary education, where we can standardize it across the country and then fund it. But we have a model of a policy in terms of our healthcare policy. So we have the Canada Health Act. Why can't we have a Canada Post-Secondary School Act that says, we're federal government will fund education. We have 5 standards by which provinces, they have to abide by these standards in order to get these funding. So you can ensure funded and well administered quality education right across Canada, right? And look at our funding formulas, right? Stop funding the jets, start funding the pilots. I don't know, but like, start funding people, right?
Education for the pilots.
Yes, let's move away from the profit-driven society. Let's move more towards a people-driven society.
Okay, great. So thanks so much. We're now at a point where we can see if there's any questions or comments for our speakers. Oh, there are none, or? Oh, okay. So nobody's asked any questions. Does anyone do people want to take an opportunity maybe to type in a question on the Google Doc or a comment? We'd love to hear from you.
Or we were that great. We just like answered
That-
everybody's
covered it all.
questions.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no
it's
loose
just like,
ends. Everything's just nicely
so nicely
has a bow
tied
on
up.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had a number of registrants, and I'm happy to say we had many provinces and different types of people sign up. Students,
Yeah.
government, people who work in government, people who work in community organizations. Yeah, and broad kind of interest in this because
Yeah.
people are seeing it in different places.
Yeah.
And they're starting to connect those dots a little bit more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you either have any kind of additional comments that you wanted to say about?
I'm sure I do. No, but it's very heartening that when you, I mean, through organizations like this and through events like this, is that, yeah, people actually, as I said before, they know what's happening. We just need people to be listened to.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suspect, and I think that a big part of talking about, well, with Beyond Campus Food Banks is to try to denormalize
Yeah.
what's something that's been normal for so long, and that so many students just kind of, it's alarming to see that people will just think of it as like, oh, there's a campus food bank to tend to poor students' needs.
Yeah.
Are there questions now? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Julia, I have a question for Drew.
Oh.
How did you go about combining the education portion with your community kitchen? Wait. She's still typing.
Okay, sure. Well, wait for the whole.
We'll wait for you to finish up, Julia. Okay, looks like she's done. I have a question for Drew. How did you go about combining the education / conversation about food security portion with your community kitchen?
So we ran a series of community kitchens. It was just a pilot project, and so there was 3 community kitchens that we did at our local community food center, which is the Regent Park Community Food Center. It's just a short streetcar ride away from Ryerson. And so we structured it so there was a cooking portion, and then while everything was stewing and baking and everyone was kind of loitering around, then we would take them away and we would have a group discussion about something. And so each week we had a theme, and we would have about like a half an hour discussion about that theme, and then we would all get food, and then as we were eating we would continue to have those discussions. And it was a model that worked really well. It was really flexible because conversation just naturally happens around food, and the students were like phenomenal speakers and just so great and had so many insights. It was a real treat to do.
Sure. Yeah, and I can say that I was involved with that program because Drew and other students, Nicole Norris and Jenna Chiande, worked on that project with Meal Exchange, and it was so powerful to see that you could bring it all together. And actually we did a lot of evaluation of that program, and the discussion piece was actually really valued by people, and just bringing together people. So I think like that whole idea of building community. If you stop thinking about how you're actually just going to feed people or you're going to teach them skills, how can you make a space like that an opportunity to talk about these really important pressing issues, not shy away from the difficult things that we talked about today, but have an honest discussion about what people are facing. And one thing that really hit home for me during that kitchen was that people were comfortable to open up about their experiences when it was in the context of a kitchen, in a way that I think other programs would have a harder time. So that was quite powerful. Does anybody have any other questions?
Going back to what we were talking about before, on the crowdfunder page, there's a video with Valerie Tarasuk, and I love her stance because she talks about how food banks are a sign of a very serious problem, but we shouldn't see them as a solution. We should just see them as an indicator that there's a serious problem happening. And I think that's kind of what needs to happen with university administration, where they go to their campus food banks and say, what are your numbers? And then that's a problem, you know, and I'm amazed that there's that disconnect there with the administrations where they're not having those conversations yet. And kind of, I think some institutions seem to even take pride in their food banks because they're student run, and that's fantastic, and they provide students with fantastic learning opportunities. We have a lot of social work and nursing and early childhood education students at our food bank who are learning an incredible lot. I've learned incredible lot from it. However, I that shouldn't be the point of what's going on. It shouldn't be our learning experience at the expense of these people, of their ability to access education. I think it's a real sign that there's a huge issue going on, and an issue that we're not really addressing.
Sure. So I see another question from the CAC coordinator. How can we move to a mutual care model and away from the stigma felt by students accessing food banks? Anybody want to?
From a mutual care to a mutual care model.
To a mutual care model,
Yeah.
sorry.
I think that the stigma around poverty, we get rid of that by not placing the onus of poverty on the individual anymore, of having more of a systemic, a social understanding of the way that poverty is actually structured into our economic system, and has been really from the beginning of our economic system. So even before neoliberalism, which just exacerbated this to the nth degree. So we do that. And I think that the way that we go into this mutual care, for me, it's about the social contract. And the social contract, you know, it's this idea that the reason that we all come together within a society is so that everybody can live a life of dignity within that society. And what we do is we, as citizens, as residents, we give a little bit of our personal freedoms, our personal power to an agreed upon government, and they are entrusted with that power so that they can rule over us in a way that is just and that is humane. And so social welfare policy for me is the social contract. And so when we can restore a healthy social welfare society, a social welfare state, then we can get into, that really is about social citizenship. That really is about mutual care. So we need to restore that. We're moving away from that because there's more and more cuts to our social safety net. We need to reverse that trend.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
I'm a really big advocate of research, as I think I've probably made clear. And I think research can add a lot to this on your own campus, because if you're researching what's happening with your students, and later Meal Exchange will be providing resources in a month or so about how to do your own research on campus. Once you have those stories and you're able to unearth that, you can really humanize this experience that students are experiencing, rather than it just being something that happens like in a back room in some building on campus. And I think really training your volunteers to understand that poverty is something that happens onto people. It's not something that people have done to themselves, and finding a way to communicate that back to your campus.
Yeah. So one of my, we have a few other questions, but I want to quickly throw in that one of my goals, or one of the goals for this project, is to, like, if nothing else, is to be able to have people, make it possible for people to situate their poverty and realize that it's not their fault that they're in this situation and they're not alone, and that it's also not acceptable. Not that we're just trying to destigmatize, oh, it's okay, we're poor, you know, like we have to kind of take up resistance and struggle. It's important to do that, because if we just destigmatize poverty, then that's when we just have, it just becomes normalized again. So it's a great question, CAC coordinator, I believe from George Brown.
Yay.
Which is great.
Yay,
Yeah.
George Brown.
Yay. Yeah, I think we're all actually connected to George Brown.
Yeah, I went there for
You-
culinary
culinary
school.
Oh, yay, I
Yeah.
teach.
community worker, and I'm a graduate.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jada from Dalhousie has said, just yesterday our Board of Governors decided to increase tuition for engineering and pharmacy by $1,000
Oh.
and agriculture by $1,400, demonstrating that they do not understand that student poverty is a crucial issue.
Wow.
I was wondering if anyone had any great ways to collect data for the Dalhousie Hunger Report instead of just gathering through food banks. I don't know if you want to maybe talk about that, Drew.
I would say none of it's available, so maybe Michael can connect you. But doing what what university did you say it was?
That was at Acadia.
Acadia, University of Saskatchewan, I believe, is doing a study on student food
They did the
insecurity as
same
well.
thing, and they came up with similar numbers. So
Yeah.
so we recognize that, you know, just looking at who's using the food bank will tell you one story, but
Yeah.
this issue is much bigger. Like I said, at Acadia, 38.1% of students food insecure, and actually 14% were severely food insecure, meaning that they skipped whole meals at least. So we need to ally with faculty, and especially academic faculty, to be able to coordinate a survey to do this. I mean, I guess students could get the kind of survey and sample size that they did. Acadia surveyed its entire student population and got like a good response rate. Meal Exchange's role, that might be out of our capacity, and it might be out of the capacity of students, but that's why it's crucial that we build connections with faculty who will just lead this kind of research. So far we have Acadia, so far we have Saskatchewan. I shudder to think what it would be in bigger, more expensive cities, potentially like Halifax or potentially like Toronto.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move on to...
But I would just also add to that is that basically extending on your thing is that universities and colleges, they already have these mechanisms in place because they do gather data from students in terms of other things. So key performance indicators, employability figures, satisfaction figures. So the mechanism is in place there. It just needs to, what is the purpose of it? So maybe that's another way of using it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, great question as well, and it's difficult to hear about that, what you have to deal with now. Quincy has a question. How can accessible food services, food bank/free food or meals, work with current university food services, inaccessible cost, diet, etc. wise? Can they work alongside each other, or is it possible to move towards services which are solely free or easier to access?
So we have a really close relationship with RU Eats in Chartwells, which are our food service provider at Ryerson. And so they do a couple things for us. They donate food regularly to us that'll go bad over the weekend, and so we freeze it. So that's a nice little food rescue thing that we do. We also go to them for sponsorship quite a bit when we're holding events. The food service provider on your campus has a lot of money. They have an incredible amount of unimaginable money. And so if you're ever hosting an event, go to them and ask for sponsorship money. I'm not sure if you have Chartwells or Sodexo are the biggest ones, right?
Yeah, well, there's Chartwells, Sodexo, and Airmark.
And Airmark, yeah.
That
So
we're aware of.
yeah, so those are all the biggest ones. So you probably will have one of those on your campus, and it's just a matter of networking and finding who to ask for, and being persistent and just keeping going back and asking them for that, because it's a good PR opportunity for them. And so you'll probably be able to get quite a bit of money, and then in our situation, we use that money then to purchase fresh food, because our food bank doesn't have a problem getting non-perishable items, but we do have a problem getting fresh foods. So we then use that money for that purpose.
I want to add on this question that I think that it's important to, we were actually at a tabling event where we asked people to just share their thoughts and then hashtag end student poverty. And one person brought up the prices at within cafeterias and how it's not accessible to many people. So I think that if you are going to be working with food service providers, a key demand has to be, or something that you don't sacrifice is the affordability of the food. You might aspire to want to have local or sustainable food in your cafeterias, and that's a big part of what Meal Exchange's work is on the sustainable food file. But we've come to a point where we know that student poverty is a growing issue, so we can't expect students to pay more for
Yeah.
food when they're already having difficulty affording any food. So it's important to put that front and center. So one thing that recently with Ryerson, there was a big push and they did a survey. Our friend Andrew McAllister did a survey and found that people are willing to buy healthier food and buy good kinds of food if it's comparable in price. And that led to the creation of what's called the friendly fiver. So if you go to Ryerson, you can buy a pretty decent meal for $5. So not losing sight of that affordability and trying to make the mainstream food service on your campus accessible is, I think, an important thing to do. I interviewed Chris Hedges a little while ago because he was speaking at the Tommy Douglas Institute. He's of the mind that everybody, that school is a full-time job, and you should be provided with meals and board paid for by the state. And I just think about like that shocked me because we work with students who almost exclusively work. They all work part-time at least. So it would be a huge change. But that whole idea of integrating people into the same food system is a powerful idea that I think that you should check out. I mean, I think I have the Chris Hedges video lower, so it's interesting to hear his thoughts on that as well.
At George Brown, we also have a culinary school that is internationally recognized. And so what started to happen is that, every day the chefs in training are making food. And so what many of our students have found is that they can go and buy a fantastic meal, a really frou-frou meal as well. Sometimes if they're making lobster bisque or something for like $2, and things like that. So it's also making use of what is on campus. But again, this is part of the short-term measure, right? We also have people who are studying, growing and whatnot. We have a good food market, which is about bringing in locally grown organic foods into the college and selling them to the students at fairly good and reasonable prices as well. But you know what, Chris, what Chris Hedges was saying, I mean, I fully believe that is what we would like to aim for. And Henry Giroux, who was actually our first speaker at the Tommy Douglas Institute, he had come back recently and he was saying that, if you took all of the bursaries and the grants and the little piecemeal subsidies and you put them together, you could probably fully fund education and everything associated with it, Yeah. So we might be just, shooting ourselves in the foot as well with these short-term measures.
Definitely, yeah, that needs to be said for sure. So I want to thank everybody who tuned in. I want to thank Professor Resh Boodhoo, and Drew Silverthorne for sharing their thoughts. Thank you all for attending. Once again, we have tons of resources here and more to come that will be in this document and shared otherwise. This is just the beginning for us. Want to ask again for your support on the crowdfunder. So if you go to endstudentpoverty.causevox.com, you can make a donation there. It would also be helpful if you could share that with your contacts. Faculty are a big group that we're looking to express their solidarity by making a donation. So if you could do that for us, that would be amazing. And we will have this video broken up into excerpts for you available within the next couple of weeks. So thanks again, and hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thanks,
Hi,
everyone.
thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.